passage, and I'd request any one of us to read. It is the entire chapter, chapter 5, and 6. We'll read till verse 9. So, can any one of us please read that entire bit? And while I expect each one of you to please concentrate on the passage itself, I mean, alongside, and be attentive and read it. So,
Shall I read?
anyone? Yeah, please.
Esther's banquet. Now it happened on the third day that Esther put on her royal robes and stood in the inner court of the king's palace, across from the king's house, while the king sat on his royal throne in the royal house, facing the entrance of the house. So it was when the king saw Queen Esther standing in the court that she found favor in his sight, and the king uh, held out to Esther the golden scepter that was in his hand. Then Esther went near and touched the top of the scepter. And the king said to her, "What do you wish, Queen Esther? What is your request? It shall be given to you, up to half the kingdom." So Esther answered, "If it pleases the king, let the king and Haman come today to banquet that I have prepared for him." Then the king said, "Bring Haman quickly, that he may do as Esther has said." So the king and Haman went to the banquet that Esther had prepared. At the banquet of wine, the king said to Esther, "What is your petition? It shall be granted you. What is your request up to half the kingdom? It shall be done." Then Esther answered and said, "My petition and request is this: I have found favor in the sight of the king, and if it pleases the king to grant my petition and fulfill my request, then let the king and Haman come to the banquet which I will prepare for them, and tomorrow I will do as the king has said." Haman's plot against Mordecai. So Haman went out that day joyful and with a glad heart. But when Haman saw Mordecai and in the king's gate, and that he did not stand or tremble tremble before him, he was filled with indignation against Mordecai. Nevertheless, Haman restrained himself and went home, and he sent and called for his friends and his wife Zeresh. Then Haman told them of his great riches, the multitude of his children, everything in which the king had promoted him, and, and how he had advanced him above the officials and servants of the king. Moreover, Haman said, "Besides, Queen Esther invited no one but me to come in with the king to the banquet that she prepared, and tomorrow I am again invited by her, along with the king. Yet all this avails me nothing, so long as I see Mordecai the Jew sitting at the king's gate." Then his wife Zeresh and his friends said to him, "Let a gallows be made, 50 cubits high, and in the morning suggest to the king, and Mordecai be hanged on it. Then go merrily with the king to the banquet." And the king pleased Haman, so he had the gallows made. Chapter 6. The king honors Mordecai. That night the king could not sleep. So one was commanded to bring the book of the records of the Chronicles, and they were read before the king. And it was found written that Mordecai had told to Bigthana and Teresh, two of King Enoch's, the doorkeepers who had sought to lay hands on King Ahasuerus. Then the king said, "What honor or dignity has been bestowed on Mordecai for this?" And the king's servants who attended him said, "Nothing has been done for him." So the king said, "Who is in the court?" Now Haman had just entered the outer court of the king's palace to suggest that the king hang Mordecai on the gallows that he had prepared for it. The king's servant said to him, "Haman is there, standing in the court." And the king said, "Let him come in." So Haman came in, and the king asked him, "What shall be done for the man whom king delights to honor?" Now Haman thought to his heart, "Whom would the king delight to honor more than me?" And Haman answered the king, "For the man whom the king delighted to honor, let a royal robe be brought, which the king has worn, and a horse on which the king has ridden, which has a royal crest placed on its head. Then let this robe and horse be delivered to the hand of one of king's most noble princes, that he may array the man whom the king delights to honor, then parade him on horseback through the city square, and proclaim before him, thus shall be done to the man whom the king delights to honor. Then the king said to Haman, hurry,
Yeah.
take the rope 10.
Only till 9. Only till 9. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for reading that long bit. So good evening, sisters. And today the title of our session is Robes of the Redeemer. I have divided the portion and the passage in two parts. That is the purple robe, and the second is the desirable robe. So let's jump right into it. Chapter 5 opens on the third day of the fast that Esther had called for. And in that fast, she identified herself with the Jews in Susa and elsewhere in the Persian Empire who were stricken with grief over the notorious, irreversible edict of the king to annihilate the Jews. For a person gone without food or water, if we were to literally understand how the narrator describes the fast to be, that was without any food or water, it is only logical to think that Esther would be weak in her body. But here in the opening statement itself, you see a woman displaying strength like never before. Esther puts on her royal robes. This can help us with an imagery of the queen putting on her robe, conveying that she meant business. Now, it is not random for the word royal robes to be placed there in this particular passage. Now, if you take a look at the portion from verses 1 to 8, okay, from 1 to 8, they are pretty indicative of a royal kingdom. The number of times the word royal comes in. So there's the usage, the vocabulary which is used includes inner court, king's palace, royal throne, golden scepter, feasts. Now, all of this giving us a flavor of the royal discourse. And what is this royal discourse? It is technically in stark contrast with the realities, with the actual realities that were taking place outside the palace. It was the outside the palace, there was tension, there was confusion, there was chaos, there was fasting, not feast. There was fasting that clouded the empire. So we see a stark a contrast. So Esther putting on royal robes, we can say that Esther puts on confidence, assertiveness, grit, with which the girl, something which the girl has probably never displayed up until this stage in her life. Now, why I say this? Because it pretty much justifies what Mordecai mentions in the previous passage, in the previous chapter, where he mentions, who knows, Esther, who knows whether you have not come to the kingdom for such a time as this. Requiring or calling upon Esther to act in a way that she has never ever before acted in, because of the very uniqueness of the circumstances and beautifully, coincidentally, uniqueness of Esther being placed where she was as the queen of the Persian Empire. The situation was so unique, it called for unique reaction, unique response. So putting on royal robes was symbolic for her, conveying something by way of her garments. Now, clothing in general, in the Bible and in the history of God's interaction with his people, it finds very unique placement. And sometimes it is read very passingly when we are reading our Bibles. Outward attire sometimes symbolizes inward realities. And in Bible, even clothing has spiritual significance. The first mention of clothing, and I'm pretty sure this would be something that we'll also remember off the cuff, happens in the Garden of Eden. Now, when Adam and Eve sinned, their eyes were open, which means, which is basically conveying the idea that they were made aware of their nakedness, and accompanying shame, which caused them to fashion their own clothing, and they sewed fig leaves together to try to cover their bodies. Now, even in the Garden of Eden, Adam and Eve needed God and his mercy, who graciously clothed them. Here, clothing signified the dependence on God, the need for being fathered, taken care of, the realization of our own inability and incompetency to exist without fatherhood of the Most High. Scripture uses metaphors all the time in order to illustrate concepts, and one such metaphor is clothing, or we can say, you can see the variations, to be clothed. So putting on her royal robes, Esther bravely sets out for King's palace, where King Xerxes was sitting on his royal throne. Now, it is by the end of chapter 4, as highlighted last week also, that we see a movement and a progression in Esther's character. And today also, we see in chapter 5 how the development continues, where the always obedient girl Esther is taking time to analyze. She uses courtroom tactics. She's aware of her own beauty. She's aware of her position as a Jew. She is even aware of the consequences of her going uninvited before the king in strict non-compliance with the law. Throughout human history, clothing is somewhere an indication of person's status, wealth, position in the society. And Bible contains many examples of clothing being used to communicate communicate different things. Historically, royal robes were worn to distinguish them from commoners, and this is exactly the way it is used in this passage in Esther. It was used to distinguish her. She wanted to distinguish herself from the commoners at that point of time when she put on her royal robes. Now, in our last session, we also saw something which is something of clothing that Mordecai had put on sackcloth, which is a coarse material usually worn during grief and mourning, and it was symbolic of remorse or tragedy in a particular context. So when we read clothing, let us watch out for these things, when they mean something deeper, something meatier than the apparent clothing. Now, in chapter 1, Vashti risked her life by refusing to appear before Xerxes when she was summoned. This is in chapter 1, verse 12. Now, in another story's ironies, here you see Esther now risks her life by appearing before the same king, unsummoned. The threat of death and hope for life, they both are equally present as Esther gathers the courage to approach before the king. In her royal robes, she decides to identify with the people of the Jews of Susa, and she also claims her authority and power as a queen of Persia in going before the king. Esther is referred to, very interesting point, that Esther is referred to in the entire book around 37 times. And it is only 14 of those references which make use of Queen Esther. And all of those 14, except for one, occurs after chapter 5, verse 1. Esther assumes the dignity of her royal position, but does she claim her true identity as a woman of God? That is the question we all must ask ourselves. She does assume dignity of her royal position, but does she claim her identity as a woman of God? So in between, I've put in certain poetic flavors. So here is one of them. Yes, Esther, you were clothed in a queenly attire, but realize, would you stand in those robes without the hidden hand of God covering you? Oh, Esther, yes, you were a beauty to look at and won favor in eyes of all. But know that your favor lies not in what you chose to do or you chose not to do, or what you chose to clothe yourself with, because the covenant keeper already clothed you, Esther. The covenant keeper has his eyes set on you. The chapter is full of irony, and the passage we are looking at today will only make it will compel one to think of the true kingdom of which we are part of, How? By the finished work of Christ at the cross, and place us in the midst of an excitement which anticipates the second coming of the true king. This is what this passage will do to you today. I mean, it will directly place you there. As you reach this junction of the story, the reiteration of royalty, extravaganza, and apparent generosity of the king seems vainglorious. That is, overly vain. I love that word, vainglorious. He's saying that I'll give you half of the kingdom. But we know, what does he mean? The king with a royal scepter. And a scepter is basically a staff which monarchs hold, and that was to symbolize their power and authority. Okay, so that is what scepter means. Now, King Xerxes' scepter was made of gold, but we know what kind of an authority and reign was his. What was Persia under Xerxes? Xerxes, even the historians record that Xerxes was the ultimate downfall of the Persian Empire. Now, Esther, when she enters the courtroom, she begins with expected flattery, because those are the courtroom tactics. These are things which you have already seen, how people usually talk with the king. She starts off with the expected flattery, and she invites Xerxes along with Haman to a banquet. Now, Esther also adds flattery to flattery. Okay, she doesn't just stop there. She's adding flattery to flattery by suggesting that she wants to honor the king. She wants to honor Xerxes with a banquet. She also makes the refusal to this banquet a little difficult by indicating that she's already prepared that banquet. She also asks the king to summon Haman. Another poetic flavor. Oh, Xerxes, you think it's your golden scepter that is the decision maker? O king, you failed to be wise and took counsel with the fools who were given to their debased minds and desires. And so were you, O Xerxes. Your throne may make you feel that you are in charge of this kingdom, but O Xerxes, you are oblivious to the real kingdom where even statutes of self absorption, such as you, are included. O Xerxes, in your pomp, you offered the queen half your kingdom to which you brought only doom, not even a dime. O Xerxes, you forget that the writer of this story gave up not just half his kingdom, but wealth weighed in eternity. It is the story of his generosity and love for his eternal son that you also find a mention, O Xerxes. Rulers like Xerxes create in us a desire for the true king, who is in stark contrast to the rulers of the earth. The true Davidic king, his throne is forever and ever. His scepter is a scepter of uprightness. He is the king who loves righteousness and who hates wickedness. In the palace of the true king will stand the queen, his bride, at his right hand. Daughters of the land will not stand in front of him for physical display of their beauty. Instead, the daughters will stand as his ladies of honor. At the banquet, while the king, coming back to the narrative, that while the king was drinking his wine, he asks again to Esther that why did she appear uninvited in the royal robes in the throne room? Now, previously in the story, when Xerxes is drinking wine, Vashti ends up losing her royal position and power. But Esther, and deploying a delay tactic, Esther again asks only Haman and the king to come for a second banquet on the next day, assuring the king that she will present her request. The suspense by this part, okay, this is mostly towards the end of verse 8 of chapter 5. The suspense is heightened, not only for the king, but also for the reader. This is a narration style that is used. With this, we end our first segment. Let's come to the second part of the session, which is the desirable robe. Now, the gap between the first and the second feast is telling of the narrative, indicating a waiting period. Okay, it is indicative of a waiting period, a time gap for much discernment and evaluation by Esther. Now, at this point, it's imperative to keep the hidden hand of God constantly in mind while we read the passage, as what discernment and wisdom and evaluation are we talking about, which remains outside the scope of God's sovereign will, right? So, this period of evaluation from Esther's point of view of the narrative is also the time where Haman is feeding on the wickedness of his heart and fanning the flames of his pride. This is the segment which begins from verse 9 onwards. The irony in this portion is ever so heightened at this point. Now, where Haman and Xerxes, they think that all the things are under their control, the control and authority, including the fate of the Jews in Persian Empire. While even for Esther, I would say it is important for us to know that the fate of Jews was certainly not even in her hands. So it is important to keep the hidden hand of God in mind. Now, Haman's prideful excitement at being invited to the private dinner of the king and queen is short-lived. It's impaired just when Haman walks out towards the king's gate. Now, the narrator's selection of the words is very interesting, guys. He uses the word joyful and glad of heart. And the same word from verse 9 also appears in verse 14, the word joyful. Okay. So now, since we are, it should be understood as a tool of humor and it's comical. Okay. Now, why? Now, since we are studying from the Old Testament, the usage of the word joy, besides the joy in the general sense, it is used as a response of mind to a pleasurable event or state. Now, the Old Testament frequently uses joy as a religious emotion where religion touches the deepest springs of emotions, often finding an outward expression. The clubbing of the two words joyful and glad used in 5:8 are also repeated in 14, like I mentioned, and the word in the original language is someach. It's someach. It is the same word which is used when Solomon was anointed as the king and rode David's mule and sat on the royal throne. This is the same word which is used here. And Zadok, the priest, and Nathan, the prophet, were asked to anoint the king, and they were all rejoicing. That is someach, the word. So the city was in uproar. Now imagine, this is the joyfulness and the gladness that Haman is feeling in his heart. That's the connotation. Now, Haman placed his joy in the wrong place, something that we also did in our I think last session, where we were studying about Haman and his pride. So this man has placed his joy in the wrong place. His desire is in devoid sources, in dry sources. Hence, the joy of his heart is very short-lived. It is easily tarnished by Mordecai's response, who shows no gesture of respect and honor as Haman leaves the palace. Somewhere, Haman further feeds his pride by presumption that he is favored by the king, by the king and the queen, and he believes that he is the man the king delights in the most. So in that gap between the first and the second, this is exactly what is happening in his heart. Now, in being so drunk with his pride and anger caused due to Mordecai's reaction for not pandering to his pride, Haman only turns out to be a fool. He's fooled and blinded. He fails to see beyond himself. He literally designed his death. He builds a gallows of extraordinary size, 75 feet, not realizing that this size is the measure of his own pride. Haman takes the advice of his wife going forward in the narrative, and Zeresh counsels him to simply eliminate immediately the cause of his dissatisfaction. Haman was not satisfied with the splendor of riches, number of his sons, all the promotions that king had honored him, how the king had advanced him above officials and all the servants. All of this never satisfied him, because these things, Which all? Riches of the world, your sons, your daughters, your family name, your bank balance, they will never be enough to satisfy you, my sisters. They will never be enough to satisfy you. It's not just a story of one Haman. It's the story of mankind. No affirmation from your spouse, sisters, or from your parents will ever satisfy you to create in you the joy that you long for. What it will only cause is a hunger, a greed for more, because that road is not going outward, but it is a path coiling inward. For Haman, as for us, desires in anything apart from Christ will only make us say what? The sentence that Haman uses. Yet all of this is nothing, worth nothing to me, so long as I see Mordecai the Jew. Or we will say that I have and possess, whatever I have and possess is nothing for me. The love that I receive is not sufficient for me. I want more and more. I want something that is my kind. I want to be loved my way. I want my will, my safety, my pleasure, my money, my career, my sanity, my peace of mind, my time. Nothing that I have is sufficient. This is the language of Haman. This is the language of pride. This is the root of being inwardly looking. That is not just Haman. It's a story of mankind. Now, there is another person in the Bible who uses this phrase I found it really interesting. The phrase that, yet all of this is worth nothing to me. I'll read that portion from the Bible, okay? It's quote, and I hope you'll figure it out, but I'll still say it. Although I have reasons for confidence in the flesh, if anyone else thinks he has grounds for confidence in the flesh, I have more. Circumcised the 8th day, of the nation of Israel, of the tribe of Benjamin, a Hebrew born of Hebrews, regarding the law, a Pharisee, regarding zeal, persecuting the church, regarding the righteousness that is the law, blameless. But everything that was a gain to me, I have considered it to be a loss because of Christ. I have considered it to be a loss because of Christ. More than that, I also consider everything to be a loss in view of surpassing value of knowing Christ Jesus, my Lord. Because of him, I have suffered the loss of all things and consider them as dung. Now, this is the CSB translation. So that I may gain Christ and be found in him, not having a righteousness of my own from the law, but one that is through faith in Christ, the righteousness from God based on faith. This is our dearly beloved Paul in Philippians chapter 3, verse 8 to 9. This is another man who said that yet everything is not worth. Now, Zeresh's advice to Haman, now seeing that Haman, his power and his entitlement, it just simply failed to satisfy the man. And he wanted one more thing. He wanted just one more thing. And the only possible solution that Zeresh could offer was end of human life. Now here, sisters, Cain also had the option, and he killed his brother. When sin devours you, you will fail to master it. And if your problem is not in searching your own heart for your pride, but lies in the next person, or say a brother or Mordecai or your spouse, etc., you will only act to kill it. When your problem lies not in searching your own heart, but the other person, you will only try to eliminate that person. That's what Cain did. That's what Zeresh's advice is telling us about. Finish the root cause of your problem, right? Zeresh counsels Haman simply to kill Mordecai. The satisfaction of human pride in its demand for honor and respect outweighs the value of human life in pagan world of Persia. I mean, is it any different? 21st century India? Haman, being blinded by his own pride, hastes to eliminate Mordecai and follows the evil advice of his wife and friends. Now, technically, this is following his advice. Just let me put you back like on a it is very much in contrast of what the king, the first order of king said, that every man should be ruler of his own household. I found it really interesting. Now, by commanding respect through the brute exercise of power, the king and Haman may be able to save face, but reality laughs behind their backs. This is Karen Jobes, the commentator who's written on Esther. He says, Haman may be able to save face, but reality laughs behind their backs. After the king's banquet with Esther, he is unable to sleep. Now, Xerxes decides to review court business, the Book of Chronicles, and which was an official record of the Persian kings, in which the official transcription of courts was recorded. And from the official transcripts, the king would draw up a list of those who were rewarded for the faithful service to the throne. And that night, the phrase that night certainly suggests God's providence for us, sister. Because that night, the author intends the reader to see God's hidden hand in causing the king's sleeplessness and reading the court records at the exact spot where Mordecai was mentioned. The Persian kings prided themselves rewarding well for those who would help them in a very significant fashion. So they took pride in rewarding them. And Xerxes realized that he had failed to honor Mordecai, so he decided to repair this error immediately. Now, the plot is at its climax at this point. And we see now the night has gone. Now, could it just have happened that Haman was in the court at this hour? Haman came early to be sure of an audience with the king to annihilate Mordecai as quickly as possible. That's why he comes into the court early, ensuring something else in his head, right? He's come up prepared. Haman did not have a chance to tell the king why he was there. What was there in his mind? He just doesn't get the chance, because the king immediately asks him, what should be done for the man the king delights to honor? Now here comes the pride knocking at Haman's doors. He is simply lost in what the king asks and sets into a Disneyland. Look at the description of how Haman thinks the man who king delights in should be honored. That in itself is telling. He just couldn't think of anyone but himself. His pride blinded him. Haman suggested the highest honors, assuming they were for himself. The narrative is full of irony and reversal of expected outcome, my sisters, up until 9. I mean, that's the interesting bit that I deliberately took up until this point. Now, in wanting the praise of the praiseworthy, Haman wanted the royal robes to be put on him. The robes that were worn by the king. Again, here the usage of the robes is metaphorical. Putting on robes of the king and to ride on the horse of the king was considered to be the highest mark of honor that could be shown and displayed to a subject. But sisters, Proverbs 16:18 says, pride goes before destruction, a haughty spirit before a fall. For the man the king wants to honor, read with, I mean, you look at me, look at verse 8 to 9. Have them bring a royal garment that the king himself has worn, and a horse the king himself has ridden, which has a royal crown on its head. Put the garment and the horse under the charge of one of king's most noble official. Have them clothe the man the king wants to honor. Parade him on the horse through the city square and proclaim before him, this is what is done for the man the king wants to honor. Now hold on to these two verses, okay? 8 and 9. Haman words the greatest desire. This is a quote, okay? And he's wording the greatest desire, the desire to be delighted by the praiseworthy. Now see how narrator 2 has placed these words, okay? They don't reflect, don't they reflect the trace of a desire of being delighted by one and only? Isn't that what it is trying to hit at? Tim Keller says, we demand love more than we can actually give. We demand the love so pure. We desire the love, the imagery of which is like consuming fire. He says, we are created in the image of such love, the one which is like consuming fire. We're created in the image of such love, and this is why we long for such love that truly, truly satiates, because we were created in the image of such love, love whose imagery was a consuming fire. The love in which the world was created is the furnace in which you were forged. You and I, sisters, we were forged in this furnace. You were created in that fire, sisters. That is why no other love can melt you or warm your heart, my sisters. The love of God is the fireplace you got to camp near, or else you are lost. Or else you're lost. Don't we long to be affirmed, feel loved, and feel adored? Now, it'll be only foolish to think that we don't need such love. For we are designed to be recipients of love just like that, of a love just like that. The king delighting in the man is reflective of the eternal fatherhood of God, the Father, whose delight was in his eternal Son. It is because of the delight of the Father that the Son lived a servant. He became sin. He who knew no sin became sin. He bore the wrath. He bore the cross, for the Father delights in the Son. Haman's description gives the imagery of what and how the man in whom the king delights was to be honored. This is his description. Now, keep your eyes on verses 8 to 9. I'm going to read one line, and I'm going to read one line from the passage and place another line, okay? It says, verses 8 to 9, have them bring a royal garment that the king himself has worn. Now let's look at Christ. He was also brought a royal garment. What was that garment? It was a scarlet robe, my sisters, a robe of mockery. Next, a horse the king himself has ridden, which has a royal crown on its head. Even Christ came saddled, but not on a horse, but on a donkey. From being on a donkey to carrying a cross, he bore it all. There was a crown that was set, but the crown was the crown of thorns. Now come back to the passage. It says, put the garment and the horse under the charge of one of king's most noble officials, right? Look at Christ. He too was led by soldiers and by Simon, man of Cyrene. Next line in the passage, have them clothe the man the king wants to honor. Let's look at Christ. Christ was also clothed, but he was clothed in mockery and shame. He is the eternal Son in whom the eternal Father delights. Next line, parade him on the horse through the city square and proclaim before him, this is what is done for a man the king wants to honor. Christ was also paraded, and they shouted, this is Jesus, King of Jews. This is how they mocked him. But this king, this true king, my sisters, was honored, seated at the right hand of the Father. His kingdom come, his will be done. O the anointed, you must return. To rule with the iron scepter. To take the bride you have yoked yourself with. The bride you will never give up. The bride you will never give up. O anointed one, you must return. Thank you so much, sisters.